Vivid verses.
I have always believed that a man reveals himself most clearly in the moments when he chooses not to react. Not because restraint is easy. It isn't. But because the space between provocation and response is where character lives, and I made a decision a long time ago about what kind of man I wanted to be in that space. My name is Ro Callahan. I'm 34 years old. I run a mid-sized structural engineering consultancy out of the Vantage District, a refurbished industrial quarter on the east side of Carnston, where the old textile warehouses were converted into office buildings sometime in the 90s and have been quietly elegant ever since. We do 12 to 15 projects a year, mostly commercial developments, occasionally something civic and interesting. I have 6 full-time staff and a rotating roster of contractors, and I built the whole thing from a single inherited drafting table and a client my mentor handed me on his way into retirement. I'm not telling you any of this to impress you. I'm telling you so you understand the kind of thinking I apply to everything. Structural engineering is, at its core, the science of identifying where pressure will concentrate, what will hold and what will fail, and how to build systems that remain stable under load. I do not think this professionally and then leave at the office. It is simply how I see the world, which is relevant because this story is about Petra. I met Petra Voss at a dinner party hosted by my friend Colm and his wife Rue at their townhouse in Aldworth. It was a Saturday in late October, one of those evenings where the city smells like rain that hasn't arrived yet, and everyone seems slightly elevated by the anticipation of it. Colm is an architect I've collaborated with on 3 projects, and his dinners are always the right size. 8 to 10 people, good wine, a mix of professions so the conversation doesn't collapse into industry gossip. Petra was seated across from me. She was striking in a way that made you notice her before you meant to. Dark hair, very direct eye contact, the kind of posture that either comes from confidence or from practicing confidence until they become the same thing. She was a brand consultant, she told me. She worked with emerging consumer companies on identity and positioning, which I found genuinely interesting because it was essentially what I did with physical structures applied to perception and narrative. We talked through the pasta course and most of dessert. She was sharp, quick with language, good at listening, or at least very good at appearing to listen, which I recognized as a skill even if I didn't immediately distinguish between the two. She laughed at the right moments and asked follow-up questions that proved she'd retain what I'd said. And by the time Colm opened a second bottle of Albarino and someone suggested moving to the living room, I had her number on my phone and a tentative plan for dinner the following Thursday. The first 3 months were excellent. I won't pretend otherwise, because dishonesty about the good parts would make everything that followed seem inevitable, and it wasn't. She was fun to be with, socially fluid, ambitious in ways she could articulate clearly, and she had opinions she would actually defend rather than softening them the moment she sensed any pushback. I respected that. We traveled to Valset for a long weekend in December and walked along the harbor in the cold and ate at a small restaurant where the owner brought out dishes we hadn't ordered because he thought we'd like them, and we did. I remember thinking, somewhere around the end of January, that this felt sustainable. Not just enjoyable, sustainable. Which, for me, is the higher compliment. The first inconsistency was small enough that I cataloged it without attaching meaning to it. We were at a gallery opening for a photographer friend of hers named Oswin, and someone mentioned a project Petra had worked on for a beverage startup. She described her role with specificity and confidence. But 2 weeks earlier, telling me the same story over dinner, she described a different scope of work, different enough that the narrative didn't reconcile. I didn't say anything. I simply filed it. The second inconsistency came a month later at a birthday dinner for Rue at a small restaurant in the Daleford Quarter. Petra had mentioned twice that she didn't have a strong relationship with her sister, that they were cordial but distant. At dinner, she told a long, warm story about advice her sister had given her during a difficult period, referencing a closeness that didn't match either previous account. Again, I said nothing, but I have a mental filing system that is not optional. It simply operates the way a good building's drainage runs whether or not you're thinking about it. It was in the third month that the language started changing. I noticed it gradually. Phrases that carried a specific texture. When you do that, it triggers something in me. I need you to hold space for how I'm feeling right now. That felt emotionally unsafe. Used once, any of these phrases might simply be the vocabulary of someone engaged in therapy, which is a legitimate process that produces legitimate insight. I have no objection to the language of emotional literacy in principle. But there is a difference between using language to communicate and using language to maneuver, and the distinction is whether the language is being deployed to arrive at understanding or to foreclose it. Petra's phrases were always deployed at moments of accountability. Whenever I raised something that had made me uncomfortable or questioned a discrepancy, or simply disagreed with her, the language appeared as a kind of shield that made examination impossible. You cannot interrogate a trauma trigger without positioning yourself as the one causing the trauma. That's the architecture of it. It converts every attempt at honest conversation into evidence of harm. I noticed this. I did not raise it immediately because I'm not impulsive and because I wanted to understand the full shape of the pattern before I named it. The shaping completed itself on a Thursday evening in April. We had made plans to attend a small dinner at the home of my colleague Bram and his partner Sylvie in the Kettner Hill neighborhood, a gathering of about 6 people. That morning, Petra texted to say she wanted to bring a friend named Kasia, someone I'd met once briefly, because Kasia was going through a difficult period and Petra felt she needed the social warmth of the evening. I texted back that it was Bram's dinner and that I'd need to check with him before committing to an extra guest. This was not a refusal. It was the correct and courteous procedure. Petra called me 20 minutes later. "I'm feeling like you're not prioritizing my emotional needs," she said. "I'm prioritizing the fact that it's not my house," I said. "Give me 10 minutes to call Bram." The fact that your first reaction was to say no is really activating something in me. My first reaction was to say I needed to check. Those are different things. There was a pause. This conversation is starting to feel emotionally violent. I looked out the window of my office at the street below. A delivery worker was locking a bicycle to a post. The sky was the particular gray that means rain by evening. Emotionally violent is a significant phrase, I said. What specifically did I say that you describe that way? It's not what you said. It's the energy. I can't respond to an energy. I can respond to words. This is exactly what I mean. You're being extremely triggering right now. I recognized the completion of the loop. Any response I gave would be absorbed into the frame she'd constructed. Agreement would validate a false characterization. Disagreement would prove the characterization. The only move available to someone operating in good faith inside a system designed in bad faith is to step outside the system entirely. "I'm going to call Bram," I said. "If he's happy to include Kasia, she's welcome. I'll let you know within the hour." I hung up, calmly, without anger, without performance, without apology. Bram said yes without hesitation, as I suspected he would, because Bram is easy and the dinner was informal. I texted Petra. "Kasia is welcome. Bram is happy to have her. See you at 7. Her response came 20 minutes later. "Thank you. I'm still processing this conversation." I read it, set my phone face down on my desk, and returned to the load analysis I'd been working on before she called. The dinner at Bram's was pleasant. Kasia was quiet and clearly grateful to be included, which made Petra's framing of the situation more legible in retrospect. There had been no real urgency, no particular need that required the phone call and the escalation. It had been a test of whether I would capitulate to emotional pressure, and I hadn't, and nothing bad had happened as a result. The food was good. The conversation ranged widely. I drove home at 11:15 thinking clearly. Over the following 2 weeks, I began to notice how consistently the escalating language appeared in our interactions, and how consistently it was connected to moments where I exercised independent judgment. If I made a decision about my own schedule without consulting her first, if I declined an invitation, she'd accept it on both our behalves without asking. If I expressed a preference she hadn't anticipated, the language had a grammar to it that I began to parse. Step 1. Name an emotional state as though it were a consequence of my behavior rather than a response to it. Step 2. Assign clinical weight to the state using therapeutic vocabulary. Step 3. Position any attempt at clarification or disagreement as evidence of the original harm. Step 4. If none of this produced compliance, escalate the named consequence. I was watching a behavioral pattern designed to modify conduct through the gradual inflation of emotional stakes. It was, when examined objectively, quite sophisticated, but it required a subject who either felt genuine guilt upon hearing these phrases or who feared the social consequences of being labeled the person who triggered someone's trauma. I don't carry guilt I haven't earned, and I'm not afraid of labels I don't deserve, which is probably why the pattern kept escalating. It wasn't working and she couldn't understand why, so she turned up the pressure. The conversation that clarified everything happened on a Sunday afternoon. We were at my apartment, a converted warehouse space in the Vantage District, high ceilings, exposed brick, the kind of place that had required significant structural retrofitting, which I had overseen personally, which gave me a particular satisfaction every time I was in it. We had been discussing, in what I thought was a productive way, the fact that our communication styles seemed to create friction. I was trying to name specific incidents and examine them. She kept redirecting the conversation toward her internal experience in ways that made examination of the incidents impossible. Then I said, gently but clearly, I've noticed that when I raise something specific, the conversation shifts to how I'm making you feel, and we never actually examine whether what happened was reasonable. I like us to be able to do both. The pause that followed was different from previous pauses. Longer. When she spoke, her voice had a quality I hadn't heard before, something tight in it, compressed. I'm going to have to tell my therapist about this, she said, about how you behave in this relationship. She needs to know. I looked at her steadily. There was nothing in me that felt the alarm this statement was presumably designed to trigger. I simply registered it as a move, noted what it was intended to accomplish, and considered how to respond to it accurately. I encourage you to be honest with your therapist about everything, I said, including this conversation. She blinked. What? If you're speaking to someone about our relationship, they'll be more helpful to you if they have the complete picture, including what I've said in this conversation and exactly how I've said it. This wasn't what she'd anticipated. The threat of involving a therapist is designed to invoke a particular response, defensiveness, or pleading, or preemptive justification. It assumes the subject will be concerned about being characterized negatively to a professional. But I had nothing to hide from an honest account of this afternoon, so I didn't feel the weight of the threat at all. If anything, I meant what I said. A genuine therapist, hearing an accurate account of this conversation, would have useful things to offer about the dynamics in play. You're not even bothered, she said. Her voice had shifted again, this time to something that sounded more like genuine frustration than performed injury. I'm bothered by the patterns in our communication, I said. I'm not bothered by the idea of you speaking to your therapist. That seems healthy. She left shortly after. Not dramatically, she gathered her jacket in her bag and said she needed some air, and I said that was fine, and she went. I made coffee and stood at the tall windows, looking at the street, and thought about what I was dealing with. Something wasn't adding up, and I needed the missing information before I decided anything. The mutual friend was a woman named Sable, who had known Petra from university and who moved in the same social circles Colm and Rue inhabited. Sable and I had a natural, easy rapport from several overlapping dinner parties over the years, and I trusted her because she was consistent, the same in every context, which is rarer than people acknowledge. We crossed paths on a Wednesday evening at a wine bar in the Fen Quarter called Cassiel's, which did a rotating list of natural wines for small producers and had the good sense not to play music loud enough to prevent conversation. She was there with two friends. I was meeting a colleague who left early. We ended up sharing a table for 40 minutes. I didn't approach the subject directly. I asked generally how Petra was doing from her perspective, framing it as the question of a partner who cared rather than an investigator collecting data, which was both true and useful. Sable's response was interesting. She paused in the way people do when they're deciding how much to share. She's been really into this life coaching thing, she said, choosing her words with some care. Life coaching, I said. Not a question, just an echo to give her room. She talks about it like therapy, which, it's not the same thing, but Petra has always she paused again. She likes frameworks, structure she can use. Who's the coach? The name she gave me was unfamiliar, but the context she provided was not. The coach, a woman named Tove Arend who operated out of studio in the Blythe Street corridor and maintained a significant social media presence, had built a substantial following around what she called relational sovereignty. The central framework, as Sable described it, involved identifying manipulation and control in relationships and developing language and strategies to counteract them, which would be a legitimate and useful framework if applied to genuinely problematic relationships. But frameworks are tools. Tools can be misapplied, and a vocabulary designed to describe and resist manipulation can be reverse-engineered into a vocabulary for performing it, especially if the person using it has recast themselves as the victim in a story where they are not. I sat with this for a moment, not surprised, not vindicated, just arranging the information into its correct shape, the way you orientate a structural diagram until the load paths make visual sense. Tove Arend was not a therapist. She had no clinical training that would be publicly listed. She was a life coach with a methodology and a framework and a client base of people who believed they were learning to protect themselves, but who were in some cases, apparently, learning to weaponize the language of protection. Petra had been telling me she was seeing her therapist, not her life coach, her therapist. The distinction had been deliberate. She talks about the coaching sessions like sessions with a professional, I said. Sable turned her wine glass slowly. She's very committed to it. I think she finds it gives her a lot of vocabulary. Yes, I said, it does. We moved to other subjects, and I did not return to Petra for the rest of the evening. But on the walk home through the Vantage District streets, past the lit warehouses and the dark intervals between street lamps, I made some decisions. I want to be clear about my intentions, because clarity matters to me, and I have no interest in presenting myself as anything other than what I was. I was not angry with Petra. I was not hurt. Exactly, though there was something that occupied a similar territory, a disappointment in the human tendency to choose cleverness over honesty, especially when honesty would have served everyone better. She had constructed a persona in our relationship that was at least partly built on fabrication. She had used language as a lever rather than a bridge. She had misrepresented her coach as a therapist in order to give her threats institutional weight. These were all choices. They had consequences. But I also understood something about the architecture of what she'd been doing, and I felt, I'll call it a professional obligation to the truth, that she should have the experience of encountering a system where her tactics simply didn't function. Not to punish her, to demonstrate to her, in terms she would not be able to misread, that the framework she'd been deploying was ineffective against someone who could see it clearly. This required patience. It required a particular kind of performance. Not deception, but withholding. And it required me to remain in the relationship for a brief and specific period while I set the conditions. I arranged a small dinner at my apartment. 6 people. Colm and Rue, a colleague of mine named Fraser, his wife Gemma, Petra, and myself. A Saturday evening, 3 weeks after the conversation at my apartment and 10 days after my conversation with Sable at Cassiel's. I cooked, which I do well, a slow lamb shoulder with a Moroccan spice preparation, flatbreads, roasted vegetables, good wine. The apartment looked the way it always looks. Spare, considered, everything with a reason for being where it is. In the intervening 3 weeks I had been, to all observable evidence, unchanged. Present, engaged, warm where warmth was warranted. I had not raised any of the previous conversations. I had not given Petra any indication that anything had shifted, and it hadn't, not in the way she might have feared. I had simply decided how the evening would unfold, and I was waiting for it. Dinners at my place run like well-constructed projects. Good foundations in the early courses, momentum in the middle, resolution at the end. By the time we'd cleared the main course and moved into the wine and conversation phase, the table had the loose easiness of people who were comfortable together. It was Gemma who asked, naturally and without any prompting from me, how Petra and I were doing. She was looking at both of us, warm and curious, the question entirely genuine. Petra smiled and reached for my hand across the table. Really well, she said, though we've had some conversations lately that have pushed me to do a lot of work. I've been spending a lot of time with my therapist. I had been waiting for this or something like it, and when it came, it was exactly as useful as I'd anticipated. You have a therapist? Rue asked, with the tone of someone who had tried several and had opinions. Who do you see? I went through 3 before I found someone actually useful. Her name is Tove, Petra said. She's brilliant. She works out of Blythe Street. Rue tilted her head. Tove aren't. Petra brightened. You know her? I looked into her. Rue said, with the particular precision of someone choosing their words in real time. She's not a therapist, though. She's a life coach. I almost booked a session, but I wanted someone with a clinical background. She doesn't have one. The table didn't stop. The conversation continued. Rue explaining her eventual therapist, Gemma describing her own experience. But I had watched Petra's face in the half-second after Rue spoke, and I had seen the thing that happened there. A rapid internal reorganization, the expression adjusting as she assessed the new landscape. I said nothing. I poured wine for Colm and smiled at something Fraser said about a planning committee he'd dealt with that week, and the dinner moved on. But Petra knew that I had heard it. She knew that every person at the table had heard it. And she knew, this was the part that mattered, that she had said therapist, and I had never corrected her, which meant either I hadn't known the distinction, which was possible, or I had known and had allowed her to maintain the misrepresentation until the moment it corrected itself in public, which was a different thing entirely. She would be working out which one it was for the rest of the evening. That was intentional. After the guests left, we cleaned up together in the way that had become habitual. She washed, I dried, the rhythm of it domestically ordinary. The kitchen smelled like lamb and cumin and the tail and of good wine. It was approaching midnight. Rue was right, I said, at a moment when the rhythm had settled into something she might have mistaken for comfortable silence. About Tove. She's a coach, not a therapist. Petra kept her eyes on the pan she was washing. Life coaching and therapy cover a lot of the same territory. They do, I said, though they're not the same credential. It's an important distinction when you're describing someone professionally. She set the pan down and turned off the water. A pause. I probably should have been more precise, she said. You've described Tove as your therapist in several conversations, I said in the same tone I'd been using all evening. To me, and tonight to the table. It's been consistent enough that I don't think it's imprecise. I think you wanted me to believe you were speaking to a licensed clinician. She turned now. Something was shifting in her expression. The fluency that usually characterized her was encountering friction. She was searching for the move and not finding it immediately, which was the point. I think, she started and then stopped. I also want to tell you, I said, that I've thought about what you said a few weeks ago, about telling your therapist that I'm abusive. I meant what I said at the time. I genuinely encourage you to tell Tove about our relationship, about the patterns you've identified, about this conversation. Tell her everything. She stopped again. I'd actually be interested in what she says, I said, if you're willing to share it. Because I think if you describe everything accurately, she might offer you something useful. I was not being cruel. The tone was entirely level, entirely calm. But what I was doing was removing, one by one, the structural supports of the framework she'd been operating within. The false clinical authority of her coach. The threat of external characterization. The assumption that I was unaware. Each one of these had been a load-bearing element of the approach she'd been using, and I'd been quietly undermining the foundations for 3 weeks, and now we were standing in what remained. What are you saying exactly? She asked. I'm saying that I think we've been having a different conversation than the one we appear to be having. I think you've been trying to manage me through a set of techniques you learned somewhere, and I'd like us to stop doing that. I'd like to talk directly, the way two adults who respect each other talk. That's not what I've been doing. Petra. I said her name, not unkindly. You've used the phrase emotionally violent to describe a phone call in which I said I needed to check with the host before adding a guest. You've used the phrase triggering my trauma to describe moments when I disagreed with you. You've described your coach as your therapist in order to give a threat more institutional weight. I don't say any of this to shame you. I say it because it suggests you've been operating from a place of anxiety about this relationship, and anxiety is better addressed directly. She was quiet for a long moment. Something had changed in her posture. The performance had a quality now of being heavier, costlier to maintain. I'm not trying to manipulate you, she said. The word manipulate had a slight flinch around it, which told me she recognized it. I think you've been trying to create conditions where I feel responsible for your emotional states to the degree that I stop making independent judgments, I said. I think you learned a framework for describing relationships where this is a legitimate protection strategy, but I think you've applied it to a relationship where it wasn't warranted. And I think part of what's frustrated you is that it hasn't worked. Another pause. Outside the tall windows, the street was quiet. The city at midnight in the Vantage District makes a particular low sound. Not silence, but a long breath. Why didn't you say anything? She asked. If you knew, why did you let it go on? Because I wasn't certain, I said. I needed the complete picture before I made any conclusions. I've been building the complete picture. She sat down on one of the kitchen stools. It was the most unguarded she'd looked in months. So what happens now? She said. This was the question I had given the most thought to, and I had thought about it with the same methodology I apply to structural problems. Not what do I want to happen, but what is the honest and accurate outcome, given all the information available? I think we should end this, I said. Not because I'm angry with you. I'm not. But because a relationship where one person is running a covert influence strategy and the other person is analyzing it in real time is not a relationship. It's an arms race, and neither of us wants that, or should. You've been analyzing me. Something between hurt and something else crossed her face. I've been trying to understand what was happening. That's not the same thing. It feels the same. I know, I said. I imagine it does. I paused. Petra, I think you're genuinely anxious about intimacy, and I think someone gave you a set of tools that felt empowering, but that functioned by keeping people at a manageable distance rather than actually building trust. That's worth examining. I mean that. She looked at me for a long time. The expression I saw there was complicated, something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite sadness, and was probably a combination of being genuinely seen and not enjoying the experience. You're very, she started and didn't finish. I know, I said. We stood in the kitchen for another moment, and then she picked up her jacket from the back of the stool and her bag from the counter, and she looked around the apartment. The high ceilings, the brick walls, the large windows with their view of the lit street, with the expression of someone noting the details of a place they won't be returning to. I actually like you, she said at the door. That part wasn't strategy. I know that too, I said. I like you as well. The parts that were really you were worth liking. She nodded once, and then she left, and the door closed quietly behind her. I stood in the kitchen and finished the glass of wine I'd been holding. Through the tall windows, I watched her appear on the street below, pulling her jacket against the April air, and walked to the left, toward the corner where the night bus would take her home. Here is what I did not feel: triumph. That particular satisfaction of having prevailed, which is the feeling people seem to expect when they hear a story like this one. There was no surge of vindication. I had expected there wouldn't be. What I felt was closer to the quiet that follows a complex calculation that comes out correctly. Not excitement, just resolution. The numbers matching. The structure sound. I washed my glass and put it away and turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the dark apartment with just the glow from the street coming through the windows. I had thought, during those weeks of patience and observation, about the question of whether what I was doing was kind. It is a question worth taking seriously. There is a version of the events of that evening that looks like engineering someone's humiliation, setting conditions, allowing a false narrative to surface in public, dismantling a defense system in front of an audience. But I had turned this over carefully, and here is where I landed. The kindest thing you can do for someone operating a system built on misconception is to demonstrate, clearly and undeniably, that the system doesn't work. Not to destroy them, not to punish them, to show them, in terms that cannot be reinterpreted or minimized, that the approach has failed, so that they have the information they need to try a different approach. If Petra walked away from this relationship having encountered someone who saw her tactics clearly and responded to them without anger or capitulation, and if that experience gave her pause the next time she reached for those tools, then she would be better for it. And if it led her back to Tove, Aaron's studio with different questions, not how do I get the outcome I want, but why do I need these tools in the first place, then something genuinely useful would have happened. I'm not so arrogant as to think I know what she would do with it. People do what people do, but I can control the quality of what I put into the world, and I can choose to be the kind of person who tells the truth even when the truth is inconvenient and does it without cruelty. I think about structures a lot. The way everything rests on what's underneath it. The way a building's visible form is only the surface of a much more complex and mostly invisible system of support and load distribution. People are the same. What you see is never quite all of it, and the part you can't see is usually what determines whether everything holds or fails. Petra's visible form had been compelling. The intelligence, the fluency, the warmth in the right moments. But underneath, something had been built on a kind of anxiety that required constant management, constant maneuvering. And that's a hard way to live. Harder than she probably recognized, because when you're inside a structure you've built, you tend to see only its function, not its cost. I hope she talked to someone, a real someone with real training, who could help her look at the load paths honestly. I turned out the last light and walked to the bedroom, And through the windows, I could see the Vantage District settling into its quiet late-night self. The old warehouses patient and solid around their converted interiors, unchanged by what had happened inside them. That's the thing about good construction. The drama of the human life within doesn't destabilize the structure. The walls hold, the floors hold, and the next morning, the building is exactly where you left it. So was I.
Thanks for listening.